All right, let's dive into one of literature's all-time greatest plot twists. We're going to break down the incredible climax of the ancient book of Esther, which is set in the massive Persian Empire. It's a story where a villain's seemingly perfect plan just completely collapses in the most ironic way you can imagine.
You know, you'd think the turning point of a story like this would happen on a battlefield, right? Well, no. The great reversal here begins with a king who can't sleep, a boring book of court records, and a conversation that happens way too early in the morning. It's right here that the entire plot and the fate of an entire people is about to pivot on a dime.
Okay, so to really get why this reversal is so epic, you gotta meet the villain, Haman. And when we find him, he is on top of the world. He's bursting with pride, strolling into the king's chambers, absolutely convinced that his big moment of glory has finally arrived. This one phrase, it's just stuck in Haman's head. He's obsessed with it. He's saying it over and over to himself, completely sure the king is about to throw him a massive parade for his brilliant idea, the one about wiping out the Jews. He's basically rehearsing the speech he thinks is all about him. So when the king asks him, hey, what should we do for the man the king delights to honor? Haman lays out this incredibly specific three-step plan. And you got to notice the details here. He wants to wear a robe and ride a horse that the king himself had actually used. This isn't just about getting a pat on the back, it's a total power move. He wants to be seen with the king's own glory. And this is the exact moment where Haman's massive ego runs headfirst into a brick wall of pure, delicious irony. The grand plan he just dreamed up is about to become his own personal nightmare. See, what Haman doesn't know is that the king isn't thinking about him at all. Not even a little bit. That sleepless night led him to have the court records read to him, and boom, he was reminded that some guy named Mordecai had once saved his life. And so, without saying who it is, he asks his most trusted advisor, Haman, how to reward this hero. And here it is, the moment everything flips. The king commands Haman, get moving and do all that stuff you just described for Mordecai the Jew. Can you just imagine the look on Haman's face? Hearing that name, the one man he hates more than anyone, the man he literally just built a gallows for, it must have frozen him solid.
So this ceremony becomes his ultimate public humiliation. He's forced to parade his mortal enemy through the city, shouting over and over again, "This is the man the king delights to honor." And afterward, he doesn't just walk, he flees home, totally shattered, covering his head like someone in deep, deep mourning.
And if he was hoping for a shoulder to cry on, forget it. He gets home, and his wife and his advisors, who, by the way, the text pointedly stops calling his friends, they hear the story and immediately know he's finished. They basically tell him, buddy, because Mordecai is a Jew, this isn't just a bad day, this is the start of a nosedive you can't pull out of. But Haman's day is about to get so much worse. He's literally hurried from that awful conversation straight to a second banquet with the king and Queen Esther. And yeah, this is an ambush. The final trap is about to be sprung. What Esther does here is just wow. It's a masterclass in diplomacy. Think about it. She has to accuse Haman without making the king look bad for signing the death warrant. So she connects herself to her people, she uses the exact language from Haman's genocidal decree, and then she cleverly spins the whole thing as a plot that damages the king's own honor. It's just brilliant. And the king? He is so clueless, he doesn't even recognize the language from his own decree. The narrative paints this picture of him just sputtering like, who is he? Where is he? Who would dare do this? He has no idea what's going on. You can just feel the panic rising in Haman as this is all happening. And then Esther delivers the final blow. She starts with these general terms, an adversary, an enemy, and then she points her finger right at him and says, this evil Haman. Game over. What happens next is just a perfect example of poetic justice. It's like a boomerang. The very gallows Haman built for Mordecai, yep, that's where he ends up being hanged. The public humiliation he was dreaming of, it happens, but to him. Every single evil thing he planned for Mordecai and his people comes right back around and hits him and his family. Okay, so the villain is gone. Problem solved, right? Wrong. There's still this massive ticking time bomb. Haman's genocidal decree, signed and sealed by the king, is still the law, and it's set to go into effect in just a few months. And here's the crazy legal trap they're in. The king himself explains that under Persian law, an edict that's been sealed with the royal ring simply cannot be canceled. It's irreversible. so that kill order is still active across all 127 provinces.
So what do? The king comes up with a pretty clever workaround. He gives his royal ring to Mordecai, who now has Haman's old job, and basically authorizes him to write a second law. Since you can't cancel the first decree, you have to issue a counter-decree to fight it.
And Mordecai's new decree is just a brilliant piece of legal work. It explicitly gives the Jews in every city permission to organize and stand for their lives. And get this, it uses the exact same verbs as Haman's decree, to destroy, to kill, to annihilate, but it aims those actions only at the armed forces who are attacking them, their women, and their children. It basically gives them the official right to self-defense.
So now you've got these two conflicting laws out there, setting the stage for a showdown across the entire empire. And this conflict, amazingly, leads not to destruction, but to celebration.
On the day it was all supposed to go down, those who hated the Jews acted on the first decree, and the Jews defended themselves. The text tells us that 75,000 of their enemies were killed across the empire, and that number really tells you just how widespread and dangerous the hatred Haman had stirred up really was. Now, the story makes a point of telling us something not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. Although the new law gave them permission to take plunder, they refused. This is so important because it shows their actions were all about survival and justice, not about getting rich.
And here we see the final total reversal. The day that was supposed to be for mourning becomes a day of feasting. The date picked for destruction gets transformed into the foundation for new festival, Purim. The reversal is absolute and complete.
Which leaves us with this final, fascinating question. How does this story, with all its palace intrigue, near genocide, and violent ending, become the basis for Purim, one of the most joyful and rowdy holidays in the Jewish calendar? It's really a powerful reminder of how being delivered from the absolute brink of disaster can transform a people's deepest fears into their greatest celebration.